from Harvest Bible Chapel or Harvest Bible Church in Windsor. And Aaron's been a friend of mine for about 4 or 5 years, and he has a keen mind. He has a lot of conviction and a very articulate, thoughtful brother, and certainly appreciate him and his leadership and his ministry. Then we have another friend and brother with us, and that would be James Kitchen. James is tuning in from Western Canada, and James is a lawyer. He works for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, but most importantly for our purposes this evening, he's a Christian lawyer, and he has a love for the church, and he has a desire to see the freedom of the church upheld in Canada, and he specializes in constitutional litigation. So thank you, James, for joining us all the way from Western Canada, Calgary area this evening. I'm going to start by just laying out a little bit of groundwork and really three, I think, presuppositions that all three of us are coming into this with. And as I develop these three presuppositions, the conflict or the challenge that we're facing right now will become self-evident. So the first presupposition is simply that the church exists by the authority of Jesus Christ. So it is the Lord Jesus Christ that established the church of Jesus, his church. He bought the church with his very own blood. And it never has existed by the permission of the state. We do not need the permission of the state to exist. It is wonderful when we receive the state's blessing. But we have existed in times past with the state's frown upon us. And we are an institution that predates all governments, and especially, most definitely, the government of Canada, the Dominion of Canada. So that is one presupposition that we're coming into this with, is that the church has been established by Jesus Christ. The church, another presupposition that we're coming into this with, is that the church of Jesus Christ is not less than the gathered people of God. So it is not a televangelist ministry. It is the gathered people of God who have gathered together to practice and participate in the ordinances, to listen to the word of God, preach together, to sing God's praises together, to pray together, to participate in the discipline of the church. And the church, the gathering of the church, is foundational or fundamental to the existence of the church. So there's number two presupposition. And then the third presupposition, which is going to really show why we're facing the challenge that we are, is that the state, along with the church, the state or the magistrate, the civil government, exists also by God. God himself has created it. In fact, we're very familiar with Romans chapter 13, verse 4, which tells us that the state, the magistrate, the civil government is God's servant. He has appointed the civil government for good, and the civil government exists as God's servant. He has given the civil government the power of the sword, and the sword is to be used to protect the good and to punish the wicked, and that is the state's role. Even our own charter acknowledges acknowledges the supremacy of God, and therefore, in that sense, would certainly be in line with Romans 13 when it says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. It's the first line in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it assumes, therefore the Charter assumes, and it's very clear, that God himself exists, that he is supreme, and that law is foundational to this land. So we have those three statements that I've just made: the authority of the church, we exist by the authority of Christ, the church is not less than the gathered people of God, and that the state itself is a servant of God to do good. And so here we have our conflict that we're running into today, whereby here in the province of Ontario and throughout Canada and throughout a good part of the world, the magistrate, the state, has commanded the church and has ordered the church to cease to function as the church for at least a season. We don't know how long that season is going to be. It keeps getting longer. Started off as 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and we don't know where this is going now. But so the state has come in, the magistrate has come in and has said that the church must cease functioning as the church. And so what I'm going to do is I want to work through this and what the role of the state is at this particular point of time as we moved into this crisis that we're facing COVID-19, a pandemic, we've been told. And I'm going to ask Pastor Aaron, first of all. Pastor Aaron, I'm wondering if you could explain to us how, I know you've thought through this, I've read some of the stuff you've put out there. Explain to us how you yourself have, I guess, wrestled through, articulated the role of the magistrate and the role of the church at this time, and how the church ought to have and ought to respond to these wishes that the magistrate has of us.
Yeah, that's good. Well, it certainly requires a bit of a multi-layered answer, but it starts off with a clear understanding, as you've mentioned, of the authority of the church. So when you read the New Testament, the church has authority granted to it by Christ to evangelize. The church has authority granted to it by Christ to discipline its own members. In fact, it's fascinating that normally when we think of the work of God in the church, we think of God initiating and the church is always responding. But in the Matthew 18 text, where the church is receiving authority from God to discipline its own, the church disciplines and God gives them the authority to kind of bind and loose. So God, it's like God is responding to the authority that he's given to his church to discipline. So we have the authority to evangelize. We have the Great Commission. Matthew 28, we have the authority to discipline. Matthew 18, we have the authority to worship. We have the authority to preach scripture. You know, there is authority, ultimate authority obviously is in the word of God. But when Paul was talking to Titus, he said, he spoke of Titus's authority as a preacher of the word of God. You have the authority to preach the word of God. And so the church has authority to exist apart from the state. Now, I think there's some things that sometimes confuse this with people. So because we talk about the church as a nonprofit, because we talk about the church as a charity at times, because we use business language like we have a church staff, we refer to our building as the church, or we talk about church budgets. And some churches, frankly, treat people like customers. All of these things, which have been going on for several generations, often create within people's minds, well, yeah, the church is nice and the church is good, but the church is just kind of like any other business or nonprofit or organization. And part of that is our own fault, frankly, because we haven't taught people well, we've been sloppy with our language. But I'm seeing this even among Christians in Bible teaching churches. It's like, well, the church isn't necessary. You know, this construction site is shut down, so why shouldn't we be shut down? Or this group is shut down, so why shouldn't we be shut down? So foundationally, we need to understand and we need to recover this fundamental truth that the church has authority granted to it by God to carry on its functions and mission. Now, as you mentioned, the church exists within various states around the world, and we happen to exist within Canada. Now, we're, in a sense, as citizens, part of the state. And in the state, there's a government that governs us. And one of the key documents that's often referred to is the Charter. So as you mentioned, the Charter recognizes the supremacy of God, the rule of law, and then it grants the citizens fundamental freedoms. We have the freedom and opportunity to travel, to work, to think what we want, to have our own opinions, and so forth and so on. And at the same time, we acknowledge that we're living our lives in a community. So we understand that, you know, we can't just leave the gate open to the pool and say, well, it's my right to leave the gate open to the pool, because if I do that, a child might walk in and drown. I can't just drive however I want on the highway because I might put people's lives at risk. So on one hand, we're Christians and our citizenship is in heaven, and the church has been granted authority by Christ to exist and do all the things that the church should do. On the other hand, we're Canadians. And we're citizens of this country. And so we're trying to be conscientious, and we're trying to be obviously thoughtful in terms of how we interact with people. So I think all of us understand that we find ourselves in this state of tension. We want to be the church, the full church, not the online church where people are just logging in and watching me preach. We want to visit the sick. We want to engage in mercy ministries in our community. We want to counsel people that have rotten marriages. We want to help people through crisis and loss. We want to be with the dying in their hour of need. We want to do all these things. We're not just asking to come back together to preach and sing some songs and pray and go home. We want to be the church. But at the same time, we're trying to balance the desire to love our neighbors. So the way I've explained it to our church is I've said, we started with a what if, then we moved to a what is, and now we're back to a what if. So what I mean by that is, a couple months ago, we had this what if. What if our actions jeopardize people's lives? And so we deferred to the government because nobody really knew what was going on. We closed down because we wanted to be cautious. And then we experienced the what is. The virus came in, it affected certain communities, the curve went up, people died, and now the curve has gone down. Medical officials are telling us that. What's fascinating is I think we've moved back into a what if. And the decisions that are being made now to close the church are not based upon the reality of multiple people dying. It's based upon the concern that people might die. It's an if situation. And I would say that an if situation doesn't necessarily justify the kind of lockdown measures, the banning of the church from worshiping, the banning of the church that's doing its mercy ministries. I think there's a middle ground we can find where we continue to be cautious and careful and conscientious, but at the same time engage in the, not the essential, let's not use the word essential of church, the vital work of the ministry of the church as harbingers of grace and proclaimers of truth in our society.
Good. Thanks, Aaron, for that explanation. And one of the things that you said early on, I think you posted it or you wrote it, or maybe it was a telephone conversation that the two of us had, was that early on when we didn't know what was going on, and all of us like, oh, what's happening? And there was a lot of concern. And I think when the magistrate stands up and says, take cover, I think it's right for a gut reaction to take cover. Mm-hmm. So one of our own elders said, if the magistrate said, look, there's a forest fire coming, get out of the church because you're all going to die, I think it would be right for a gut reaction to say, oh, okay, let's go, as opposed to stand up and say, these are my constitutional rights to be here. So I think there was wisdom early on in shutting down operations like we did. But like you've mentioned, we're now at a turning point, and I think we've been there for a few weeks. I'm wondering if James, could you explain to us constitutionally what's gone on here? So we understand that within this country, for a very long time, we've actually inherited a system of governance where we have the right to exist as a church, and the magistrate has recognized that. And so how did the government, how are they able to legally walk in and do what they've done over the last, I guess, 10 weeks or so?
Well, the legal mechanism for it is not something that has to be necessarily spoken to or engaged when the action is taken. But and it's up for debate what the government has done, whether or not it's lawful. That's yet to be decided. They did it. If it was lawful, here is how that would play out. So our constitutional system has some limitations on it that are unique, at least from the more absolute system that the Americans have. Our system is based off the Westminster parliamentary system that we inherited from the British. It specifically says in our Constitution that ours is to be like what's in Britain. And so, a lot of the rights that we take for granted we take for granted, we don't think about, come from Britain, and they've been developed over hundreds and hundreds of years. But specifically, our charter was designed in the late 70s and the early 80s to be uniquely Canadian. And one of the things that was important for people who were deciding this and debating this is to have it so that the rights would not be absolute. And what I mean by that is governments wanted an ability to be able to justify a limitation of a right so as to have more control. And I mean that in a benign way. And at least at the time, I think it was a benign desire for governments to maintain some control over situations, mandating certain behaviors and being able to, implement certain social programs that would help people, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where we get Section 1 of the Charter. So the Charter is structured such that Section 1 is the section that talks about how the government can justify violating the rights, and then all the rights are listed underneath that. So Section 2 would be the fundamental freedoms: religion, speech, assembly, association, all the ones that the church regularly exercises in order to do what it does. And we go all the way down, and eventually we get to Section 33, which is called the Notwithstanding Clause. And I'll get into that in a minute. But Section 1 and Section 33 are the two ways that the government is able to do things that do justify rights, but to do so lawfully, right? And so essentially, that is to say that in Canada, a government can lawfully violate a constitutional right. And that may surprise some people if they didn't quite know how that worked. Certainly that's different than the American system. There is no way to justify violating a right in America. The question is either whether the right is violated or not. So there really isn't much debate about whether or not the church's right to associate, to assemble, to believe has been infringed or limited or violated over the last whatever it's been, 10, 11, 12 weeks now. But the relevant legal question is whether or not that's justified, right? And that's not simply a legal question, because, as the court has said, in order to justify a rights violation, the government, and the onus is on the government, not on the people, the government has to show that there's a good enough reason. Well, that's a factual question as much as it is a legal question, right? So when the courts analyze this, they look at all the evidence. They look at the social science evidence, the fact evidence, the policy goals and the value of the policy goals. They look at all that. The government presents all that, and then the court's job is to weigh the value of that right, the seriousness of the infringement of that right, with the potential social benefit and value of what the government's trying to accomplish, right? And if one weighs more than other, that's the determination of whether or not that was a lawful violation or not, right? Probably an example most people would know about is the court got to weigh here recently whether or not it was lawful for government, in this case the law societies, for government to penalize Trinity Western University for opening a law school while still maintaining their practices and beliefs about biblical sexuality. And the courts decided that was a violation, but that it was a justified one. That the government had shown that their policy goals were more weighed more heavily than weighed more on the scales than the rights that were infringed, right? So that's how the system works when it comes to the Charter, Section 1 and Section 2 freedoms, and how that plays out in the court, and how governments would potentially justify what they did. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that, practically speaking, whether or not it's lawful or not, they can do it, and they have done it, and they've invoked legislation that does it. But that actually doesn't mean that it's necessarily lawful. And we will hopefully get a chance to find that out if there's litigation that comes out of this whole situation. The court will be able to look back on what's happened and declare whether or not, some of these individual measures, or more on a grand scale, whether or not what happened was actually lawful.
Yeah, thank you, James. One of the things that you said, you just mentioned, in essence, if the state is going to remove these rights from us, as they have, the burden of proof is on them. right? So as a minister of the gospel, as a church, the burden of proof is not on us to show that they're wrong. The burden of proof is on them to show that they're right. And I guess in my mind, when they came out with all of this, it was all about flattening the curve. Okay, this is what we heard. 14 days to flatten the curve. So I remember my last Sunday when I preached. I went home Monday, Tuesday I woke up and I'm listening to the news. I'm like, there's no way we're meeting next Sunday. They're gonna tell us not to. I mean, it was already a scaled back service this last Sunday I preached. A lot of churches are already shut down that Sunday. We didn't. And then I thought, there's no way they're going to let us go in. And in my mind, I thought, this seems like a perhaps a measured response. We're very concerned. We don't know what's going on. Let's give this 2 weeks, and then hopefully we're back worshiping together once that time's passed. Well, here we are, 11 weeks, and we really have no end in sight. 12 weeks maybe. The curve is clearly flattened, and we're not seeing dramatic increases in numbers of this virus. And in fact, we're learning more about the virus every day, which we'll talk about in a moment when we deal with some of the medical issues. But at what point should the church start asking the government to prove that these infringements upon our freedoms are indeed they can substantiate them?
This is perhaps one of the biggest struggles with our system, because there really is no way to demand an answer on that from the government except in a court of law. So you can ask, and I'm familiar with a lot of churches and church leaders all across the country that have asked or have tried to ask, and a lot of times they've been ignored, and other times they've received answers that are unacceptable, at least to them. And that's the nature of our political system, right? There is no other mechanism by which the government is compelled to give an answer, and to give a good one, except to go to litigation, right? And I explain this to people that there's all kinds of unconstitutional laws on the books, but they are laws, and they are presumed to be lawful, and until otherwise is declared by the courts, right? So unless and until a case gets before the court where these issues actually get litigated, out in the open, there is no way for people to demand from their governments that these questions be answered, and that if the answers aren't good enough, that they stop.
Well, that's a fair question. So the only way for that to be determined would be to go before the court. So what we've done as a church is we've started pushing back. Okay, so we're pushing back against what's happened. We want to be our church. We want to be as peaceful as possible. We want to be the quiet in the land, and find a resolution to this crisis that we're in. So we wrote a letter. Our church wrote a letter 3 weeks ago. I think you saw that letter, and we sent it to all area MPs, public health in Waterloo region. We sent it to the Premier, we sent it to the Prime Minister, and there was a lot of people that received that letter. Up until today, we hadn't had, there were 2 mayors that replied to us and simply deferred to the Premier, and then there was a stock kind of answer that got sent to us from the Premier. And then up until today, there'd been no contact from any governing officials other than that. And then Pastor Aaron, along with another pastor, Joe Boot, submitted a letter early this week. And I think at the end of the day, there were well over 300 churches in Ontario that have signed on to that. And when it was sent in, I think there's about 240, 250 that were sent in. So the Premier today, when he addressed the province, actually, one of his cabinet members mentioned the churches want to get back together, and there's going to be an announcement on that soon, which to me was a positive thing. I had a personal telephone call on my cell phone today from a member of provincial parliament. She said she'd like me to arrange a meeting with several other pastors to talk about this. And so, I mean, this is good. This is talk. We want to see some moves, some action, some decision, but talk is at least a start. So we've pushed back. Now, in pushing back, I've taken a little bit of criticism. I know Aaron certainly has, and this is to be expected, because I think that some Christians have a very facile understanding of what the Bible says about government, and also about what the government actually is in Canada. Okay, and so I think that some people assume that government in Canada is simply the legislature. Okay, so if the legislature says it, that's government, period. But that is not so. And maybe, James, you could explain for us just kind of some of us might have missed out on high school civics lessons, I don't know. But what is the government in Canada? What is the separation of powers? What is the division of powers? I think those are two terms that you use to describe two different things. And help us to understand that, please.
So the Canada system is based at a foundational, fundamental level on the idea that the power that a government could or would have over its people must be separated, not just amongst individuals, but as between bodies, right? So in Canada, the three main bodies would be the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. This is like grade 10 social studies kind of stuff. And it doesn't make much sense when you're learning it on paper in grade 10. But when you see it in action, then you really get it. Right. So, if you go back far enough in the history of Western nations in Europe, you would see all three of these abilities, these powers coalesced on the monarchy, right? France would be a good example. In a kingdom where we have a king that has supreme rule, he is the judge, he makes the laws, and he enforces the laws, right? So basically, the judiciary is, the judges who are making decisions, not just about laws, but about all kinds of other things. The legislative branch is the branch that makes laws, and the executive branch is the branch that enforces them. Now, not directly, obviously, because that the executive is the cabinet. It's the prime minister or it's the premier and all of his cabinet ministers, right? That's the executive, and they're not out there in police uniform, and they're not typically directly directing the police either. But if you need to have those separate for accountability, for balance, for checks and balances, you have to have those things separate. If you have any two of those powers coalesced on one body, it's inevitable that you will get abuse, right? And not because the people in there are necessarily evil or incompetent, but because they're human, right? And we've taken thousands of years to figure this out, to figure out that these three powers need to be separate. So that's the separation of powers. And that's really important, because what has happened over the last few weeks, the last couple months, everywhere in the country, is one branch has been eliminated. That's the judicial branch. It is shut down, except for emergency, criminal, and family matters. It's not there anymore. It doesn't exist. And then you have the legislative and the executive branches have been put together. So now the executive is also legislating, and that's probably the biggest problem. Right, in Ontario, with all these emergency orders, right? What that is the executive exercising legislative power without any accountability, right? Because normally the accountability would come from the legislative branch, and that's how you get all these arbitrary orders. That's how you get these arbitrary numbers about the size of how much can meet, and about what's good and what's not, and it's just one person and one person's opinion gets to say this, and that's dangerous. And we know that from history, right? So that's important to understand.
So if I may just interrupt for a moment, just to kind of move this in a direction that I'd like to see it help us to understand, James, is you have these three branches of government. There's theoretically they're to be separate. Now there's only one branch of government technically functioning, and that would be the executive. So there's not even an opportunity, really, in most senses, to challenge things in the courts at this particular point in time. Parliament's not even meeting in Ottawa regularly, as far as I know, and it's not a full parliament that's meeting for sure when they do meet. I'm not so. But then at the same time, when we push back against them, now as Christians, we need to be very careful about this, because we want to do it respectfully, and we understand that God has put the magistrate in a place. They deserve our honor from us and our prayers, and that needs to come from us. They deserve that from us, whether they're doing a good job or not. They deserve honor. But when we push back against them as Canadian citizens, we're technically being, if we're doing it respectfully, we're being good citizens because we're doing so at their invitation.
Absolutely. That's how democracy works, right? Participation is a key facet of democracy. Democracy requires it and encourages it, and functions only if that's happening, right? And participation means criticism. It means complaints. It means expressing contrary opinions. It means demanding that those other opinions and views be properly considered. All those things, although they sound that sounds like conflict, right? But conflict is actually a key part of democracy. You don't have democracy unless you have civilized, organized conflict, right? Because in a dictatorship or in a kingdom, you don't have conflict. You just have one person making decisions and nobody else gets to say otherwise, right? And this actually goes back to how our legal system works, right? When you have contrary opinions that have to duke it out in a fair fight, you end up at a better position, right? That's the best way to find truth. The whole concept of you find truth through opposition is actually how our legal system works, and it's how our democracy is supposed to work as well, for finding the best solutions to problems, right? So if and then this is how things get better. This is how history works, right? Is people say this is wrong and here's why, and and of course now, and see, when this is done without the sword and merely with the pen, as it always is in Canada, that's good, right? The only way you avoid the sword being used is if you do use the pen, right? The only reason we don't have violence in the streets here in Canada with all this going on is because there is at least still some dialogue going on, and some people feel like there is, and there's going to continue to be. And the moment you completely take that away is when you're going to get violence, right? You look to the eastern half of the world, and that's what happens when that dialogue is completely shut down by those who don't want to have it. You get violence in the streets, right? So we're doing our job by pushing back, as long as we're doing it. Like, this is at their invitation. This is the way our system's set up. I mean, we are self-governing individuals in a democracy. So there's not a one-to-one correlation between our Westminster system of governance and the Emperor of Rome. And thank God there's not. Yes, exactly. So, that may come as a surprise to some people, but participatory democracy means raising tough questions. It means challenging people on their ideas. It means pushing back, right? And that's actually good and healthy, and not just for the people who are doing it, but everybody else who benefits from that healthy debate, right? And that's how politics works, for better or for worse. It's how politics works in democracy. It's how it works in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. Governments would just go along doing whatever was easy and comfortable. And things wouldn't necessarily change or get better if there wasn't pushback, right? This is why you have to have an opposition in the legislature and in the parliament, right? Holds the government accountable. We all need accountability. So does the government, right? That's what this is, right? It's a form of healthy accountability when you write and you say, this is wrong and here's why and here's how, and it needs to change and I want it to change. That's healthy accountability.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And we all need accountability, right? Even anyone that's in leadership, anyone that's speaking, anyone that's saying things can anticipate pushback. And I think that's actually a biblical concept, because as iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. And when iron is sharpening iron, guess what happens? Sparks fly, and that's okay. So, Aaron, Pastor Aaron, I have a question for you. So I've asked James to help us think through this as far as our legal system goes, and the invitation for us to push back, the various branches of government that hold each other in check, which is a wonderful gift that we've inherited. Maybe, Aaron, you can help us understand, is it right, biblically, scripturally, for us to graciously, kindly, respectfully challenge those who are in authority over us?
Well, one of the things that I'm so thankful for James and his legal expertise, and very, very thought-provoking. It's been a long time since I was in a high school civics class, or even in a one-day class about such matters. But one of the things that jumped out at me when he was speaking is this idea that the power has essentially been invested in the executive. But if you actually listen carefully to the executive speak, functionally, that's not true. Functionally, they've deferred their power to the experts. And the experts are not part of any of those three branches of government. They're paid individuals by the government who are certainly skilled in certain areas of, certain disciplines. But one of the things that I think is rightfully concerning is that if you look at the makeup of a human being, so here I am on the screen, and you're seeing flesh before you. So we all know I'm a human being. I have a body. I'm a physical being. And my body requires care and concern and discipline and proper stewardship. But I'm not just this. I'm also a participant in history. I was born at a particular time and I'm going to die at a particular time. I am a social being. I require relationships in order to function. I am an emotional being. My emotions are affected for the good or for the bad by the circumstances that I find myself in. I'm subject to the economy. And I can pray all I want, but if I don't start putting calories in my mouth, my body will cease to function and I will eventually die. And in addition to that, I'm a spiritual being. And this, of course, is fundamental to the Christian faith. I'm a spiritual being. And one of my concerns in all of this is that, and I don't have a problem with someone being called an expert. There's experts in a lot of different areas of life, and we're thankful for that. But the reality is those of us that serve in ministry, we could say we're experts in the area of soul care. We're experts in the area of biblical thinking. We're experts in the area of managing the people of God. And does this mean we're perfect? No, but we are experts in this area. We don't need to apologize for that. We have expertise in this area. And what we're not seeing from the executives is they've kind of defaulted to the experts, is we're not seeing input from historians. We're seeing a little bit of input from economists, but it doesn't seem to be good input. We're not seeing input from sociologists. We're not seeing input from the faith community. We're just fixated on the matter of our physicality. And I think that's why you have an imbalance there. So because those of us that serve as faith leaders, specifically in this context, Christian pastors, because we have expertise in certain areas, if you want to call it that, that's not our daily lingo. It sounds a little bit arrogant, but we'll use it for the sake of our conversation. Because we have expertise in matters of spirituality, one of our concerns is we have no voice. We're not being discussed. We're not being talked about. You look at the mandates of essential services or non-essential services, you're kind of going through it. It's like, what does the government expect of us or not expect of us? Silence until this brief comment today, which hopefully is a result of our letter. So if it's true, and I think we would all agree with that we are more than just physical beings. I'll just give this quick example. So in our home, on our property, we have animals. We have some livestock and some pets. And we have some cattle, actually. And cattle can actually die of coronavirus. Maybe not the same brand or strand, I'm not really sure, that humans get, but they can die of coronavirus. So often there's vaccination to cattle for coronavirus. They're susceptible to that. The cattle out in the field aren't thinking about this at all. They're not stressed out, they're not anxious, they're not deliberating, they're not having conversation about it. They're just munching on grass and doing their thing. Because they are physical beings, but they're not spiritual beings. They're not social beings on the level that we are. They're not emotional beings on the level that we are. And so you can't treat a human being in crisis the same way as you treat cattle. You can't
Right.
just
No,
say,
I appreciate you saying that, Aaron. And I think what you're really driving at here is essentially, look, we understand I guess the theological term is the psychosomatic union, the union between body and soul. What affects the body affects the soul, and what affects the soul
Yeah.
Affects the body. And
So we
so
need a voice at the table.
we're coming to the powers that be.
And I would argue, if we are in fact experts in that area, it's irresponsible for us to remain silent.
Correct. And I think anyone that would say the church should not speak into issues of justice and equity would have to say that Martin Luther King Jr. should have kept his mouth closed, and would have to say that the Christians who opposed the transatlantic slave trade should have shut up. How dare the church speak into those issues of justice and equity? So I think that the church has historically had a very, very vital role to play. And in fact, I would argue historically, at least in the English-speaking world, the church has more often than not been at the tip of the spear of great advances in liberty. And
if you don't mind, with regard to Martin Luther King Jr., even though the scenarios are radically different than the one we're in now,
right,
he had to actually appeal to natural law and moral law to make his case, because civil law at the time wasn't working for him and actually didn't line up with natural and moral law. So this is where the church, and we need to kind of weigh out whether this is the time to do it or not, but this is where the church needs to at least be clear on natural law and moral law. And if there's something to be said, please say it. It's not more Christian to remain silent.
Well, natural law, I would argue, is being violated. I mean, very basically, right down to the fourth commandment, where God says 6 days you shall labor, and now all of a sudden we have a whole bunch of people who have been told to sit at home and don't work. And these are people that have invested their lives into their small businesses, and now they're being forced to violate the fourth commandment. So I think there are injustices going on before us. I think that the church has something to offer at this particular time, and I do believe that silence would make us complicit in some things that really do need to be discussed. I do think there are a lot of those who are in politics who are trying to do good, and they're trying to accomplish good out of this. We love them. We pray for them. I just shot one of the MPPs in the area. I just shot a text off that said, "Praying for you, praying for everyone in Queen's Park, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me." This is what we do, but we do have something to say, and I think what we have to say bears a lot of weight because we possess the oracles of God. So, and even when it comes to authority structures, to say that those who are subject to authority should never challenge authority, you don't apply that unilaterally. So, Aaron, if there was a lady in your church whose husband indefinitely for 60 days refused to let her outside of her house because he was afraid of her getting sick, and he kept her behind a door, and you found out about that, as a pastor, I doubt you'd say to her, "Oh, he's an authority over you, be quiet and don't challenge that." I think you'd have something to say as her pastor, and I think the police department would have something to say also. So we need to push back, and we need to ask questions about what's going on, and this is the right thing to do. So I want to move on from our little civics lessons, and appreciate everyone's input in that. And I want to move on to the whole concept of totalitarianism or tyranny, okay? And I'm wondering, James, that you're concerned about constitutional liberties. You are a constitutional litigator. So, I mean, you take people to court for violating people's constitutional liberties, or at least represent people whose constitutional liberties have been violated. You're concerned about pushing back government abuses. Like, would you help us to understand just succinctly what tyranny is, or what totalitarianism is?
Well, it's the opposite of individual liberty, right? It's a state where the government or the state has complete or near complete control over every aspect of its citizens' lives, right? And so it's there's a direct relation there between how much liberty you have and how much control the government has, right? And obviously there's plenty of examples we can point to, right? You can point to China right now, where there's a small measure of economic freedom, but there's essentially no personal or social freedom whatsoever. There's no freedom to say what you want. There's no freedom to go where you want. There's no freedom to believe whatever you want. Right, that is a totalitarian state. You can go even extreme, even further, to a place like North Korea, where just absolutely every part of your life is controlled. And if you step out of line, you face potentially even death without any justice. So it's a sliding scale, obviously, right? There's some states that are relatively free, and then there's some states that are somewhat free, and that's probably where I would put Canada right now. And then there's a sliding scale down. But totalitarianism, one of the things I think people need to understand is that that's actually the default, or at least close to totalitarian is the default, both currently now and in history, right? That's the rule. The exception is the free society, right? The exception that must be vigilantly maintained is the free society, right? You look around the world now, and there's 8 billion people, and 5-6 billion of them live in a country that have little to no civil liberties, personal freedom, individual freedom, economic freedom, right? And so, and you can't look at this without having some knowledge of and views of human nature and how people work. And I think people don't necessarily have an overt desire to control everybody around them, but that's part of our nature. It's part of our tendency. And we see that bear out in history. And it is a slippery slope, sliding into totalitarianism. It can happen merely because there's nobody else preventing it from happening. Not because there's some evil dictator trying to make it happen. It will happen on its own, right? And very sorry, I didn't turn that off.
That's all right. Like it's almost, as a pastor, I know that the natural propensity of the human heart is to slide into sin, and unless we're vigilant to fight against sin, we will move into sin. So there actually has to be a concerted effort on our part to fight against it. And I think the same thing would be true of a society that is not intentional about pushing against and fighting against totalitarianism and tyranny is a society that will naturally move in that direction. And you'll have more governance of the state and less self-governance as time goes on, unless the need for self-governance is asserted. I think that in our own country, over the last 70 years, as we've pulled away from our Christian heritage, we've most definitely moved towards a larger state and less freedom, not more freedom.
It sounds dramatic, but I think it's true that you only keep what freedoms or give back what freedoms you fight for. When I say fight, I mean with ideas and the pen. But that's the reality. I mean, government measures are not temporary unless they're made to be, right? I mean, probably the best example in Canada is the Income Tax Act, right? That was a temporary measure during World War I. Still have it, right? That's just how it works. And so people need to take seriously the threat that's currently ongoing with our liberties, because they will not all come back on their own. That just won't happen. History has taught us that. That's a fact. They're only going to come. All of them are only going to come back if the people demand that they come back, right? And so that has to happen if people truly want them back. And the longer you wait to do that, the harder it is. This whole talk of the new normal. I mean, if you normalize a loss of civil liberties, well, then the abnormal becomes gaining that back, right? And then all of a sudden, the people who want basic civil liberties are the radical libertarians, right? And so if you just acquiesce and accept what's going on, and it becomes the new normal, then you'll wake up 2 years from now, and you'll have a different Canada with much less civil liberties than we had in 2019.
And is it
decide that, right? People are ultimately going to be the ones to decide that, not the government.
No, you're right. And as a Christian, I'm motivated to do as much because out of love of neighbor, right? And one of the things that I've I said very early on when this happened, I'm much more concerned about the virility of government power than I am about the virility of the coronavirus. And I am concerned about the coronavirus. I'm concerned about people getting sick. I'm concerned about those who are mourning the ones that they've lost. This is a very real thing. But we are seeing a lot of terrible things happen due to the virility of government power also at the moment, things that we're going to talk about. But some would say, well, why are you concerned? Well, the Bible warns against these things. And because we have lived in a country that on this continent, we have always had the smile of the state as Christians. There's never been a time on this continent where we have not had the smile of the state. Certainly our ancestors in Europe knew what it was to have the frown and the persecution of the state. Many of them, particularly, I think the last time that would have happened in the English-speaking world might have been under Charles II with the Act of Uniformity, which, they had the Puritan pastors, 2,500, I think, were fired by Act of the Crown in one day. But we haven't seen this in generations in this continent. So this is a wonderful blessing, but because we haven't seen it for generations, it's not something that we're terribly concerned about, which might be to our own detriment unless we start being concerned about it. But the Bible warns you about it. You see the attempt of Nimrod with the Tower of Babel to form one world government. You see Pharaoh was a tyrant, and there's a quote in the movie The Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston was something to the effect of, he goes up to Pharaoh, he says, look, let my people go. And he says, man shall be governed by the rule of law, not by the whims of men. And that is liberty. When we are governed by the rule of law is God's law, and that is true liberty. But when we are governed by the loudest voice, we are governed by the angry mob, you end up with crucifixion of Jesus Christ at the hands of a tyrant who was governed by the rule of the mob, not the rule of the law. And you see tyranny with King Ahab, and certainly Naboth was right to resist Ahab's tyranny. Ahab demanded Naboth's vineyard, and Naboth refused. Well, Naboth is not the scoundrel in that story. Ahab is, and that's clear from the way the story is written. And of course, I think it's in Revelation 14, you're warned of the beast, which is a state gone mad. And so we've never experienced this in this country. Those of us who've, like myself, whose family's been in this country since the 17th century, it's foreign to us. There's some within our church who come from countries like Romania and mainland China, where they have experienced tyranny. And so the taste of freedom is that much more sweeter, I think, to them, because they know what it's like to be at the hands of a wicked government. James, at this particular point in time, as you're looking out across the landscape, how concerned are you about government overreach?
I don't know if I can express how gravely concerned I am. I'm deeply concerned. It distresses me. It really does. Because I get to see a lot of stuff that people don't see in the cases that I've litigated prior to COVID. So I've seen the attempts, not necessarily to take away people's freedom, but the attempts to do whatever government wants, regardless of what freedoms it violates. And I see this wanton reckless, we're going to get what we want. We don't care about your freedoms. We don't care about your rights. We're going to do whatever we can to fight, to resist that, to suppress that. That's what I see, So the state of things in Canada, in my opinion, was rather bad before this, and I don't think most people realize that, because they don't get to see what I see every day. So now that this has happened, I'm extremely concerned, right? When this started, it occurred to me, what's this going to look like a month from now, right? And so, and being a little cynical, I thought, this isn't going to be 2 weeks. And so when the flatten the curve thing ended and it started to be the stop the spread, I was, I was dismayed, but I certainly wasn't surprised. And, that's essentially what I, to myself, predicted, right? This would 2 weeks would turn into 2 months, 2 months would turn into 2 years. Now that we're after 2 months, I do hear talk of 2 years. I hear talk of, well, some things will be in place, at least some things will be in place until 2021, until we get a vaccine, right? Trudeau tried to take tax and spend powers till 2020, I think the end of 2020. So you see one thing snowballing into the next, and that's and it's hard, right? Because you don't want to be paranoid, you don't want to you don't want to say, wow, it's just all gonna go. But and this is why history is so important. I like the fact that Aaron talked about how nobody's talking to historians right now. That's a key thing. That's an easy thing to forget, but man, that's key, right? you know and the Spanish flu, I think, is instructive for this too, because how do the churches respond to that? But no, yes, I'm very, very, very concerned, and I have a sense of urgency about this, and I don't think most people share. I mean, just wait, but the longer this power is held by those who hold it, the harder it will be to see it go. And I can't press that enough about people.
People don't understand that at least in our modern context, tyranny and totalitarianism has been brought in legally through emergency measures. So Hitler brought in a totalitarian regime lawfully. Okay, with the burning of the Reichstag, there was a crisis in Germany. There was a fear of a communist takeover. So Hitler declared the equivalent of an emergency act and assumed lawfully totalitarian powers, turned Germany into a police state with the promise that the day would come when the threat would be removed and the people would be released again. And the threat wasn't removed until the Allied forces invaded and liberated the German people. So I'm not saying that's what's going on in this country, but I am saying we need to take lessons from history. And in times like this, it is the time to question the government. It's not the time to not question the government. If we're going to learn something from Scripture, and if we're going to learn something from history, and if we're going to be faithful to the Christians who've come before us. And in the English-speaking world, we have a rich history of Christians who have, like I said, been on the tip of the spear of liberty. And right, we've named our classical Christian academy here, King Alfred Academy, for that reason. He was at the tip of the spear of liberty in the 9th century. You could think of Thomas Becket, Stephen Langton with the Magna Carta, and so on. So these were Christian leaders. Stephen Langton, who authored the Magna Carta, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So we need to be very concerned about this as Christians. This is a stewardship we have, and we dare not sell our birthright for a bowl of soup. Now, I want to move on to another topic. We've talked about the legality of this. We've shared our concerns. I have pastoral concerns. James has legal concerns. I know Aaron shares a lot of my pastoral concerns here. And James, your concerns are very much as a Christian man, just as much as they are a lawyer. And both, I understand that. I want to talk about the actual virus itself. And this is something that we need to talk about, because why are our concerns about civil liberties, why are our concerns about meeting as a church outweighing, at this point, our concerns about the coronavirus? As much as we have been concerned about the coronavirus, Aaron, as pastors, we don't want it to spread within our congregations. And I know there have been those within our congregation who have been sick with it. And I don't know whether you have, we haven't talked about that, but most definitely in ours. There has not been a person in our church who has died of it. There was one family member of somebody in our church, formerly from our church, who was 85 or so years old, who recently passed away, having received or contracted the coronavirus. But we haven't lost anyone in our congregation. But we have seen people sick and recover. And we've seen family members of people in our church. I think there were 4 80-year-olds connected with our church who contracted the coronavirus and did recover. But Aaron, let's talk about this, because I know this weighs heavy on your heart just as much as it does mine. We don't want to be reckless. We don't want to be foolish. We don't want to be We don't want to possess any bravado when it comes to how we're going to deal with this. So tell me, Aaron, you're an intelligent man. You talk to a lot of people. Why do you think it's safe for you, for your congregation down there in Windsor to meet?
Well, I wouldn't say it's 100% safe, nor has it ever been 100% safe. We ask people to get in automobiles and drive to church on highways and byways. Now, obviously, the chances of someone dying on the way to church are pretty slim. In 18 years of pastoring this church, I think we've probably called the paramedics into our church services 3 or 4 times, where people had medical meltdowns unrelated to church or my preaching, I hope. But we have had that. But I would just say that life is always a balance of risk and reward. And if our church were to be given permission to open its doors wide open tomorrow, fill the whole place up, I would say, yeah, we're not doing that yet. We need to think through some issues. We need to make sure there's some, good physical distancing. We would actually want to ramp it back up carefully and slowly, rather than just throw things open and bring it back to where it was a few months ago. But in opening the doors, it's crossed my mind. If the government responds to our letter positively and says, yeah, we're going to let you, open your doors, or we're going to bless you or whatnot to open your doors to the tune of X number of people or whatnot. What if someone in our church did die? What if our church became a hotspot for a new outbreak? That's possible. But it's equally possible. In fact, it's more than possible. It's actually happening that because we're not just physical, people are going to suffer and continue to decline in other ways. I'm amazed by Christians, and people have said this to me, just pray about it, trust in the sovereignty of God. There's nobody that believes in the sovereignty of God more than me. It's a cardinal doctrine. But the sovereignty of God does not mean, it's never applied this way in Scripture, just go to sit back, let go and let God. We have to act, we're rational beings. We have to weigh the pros and cons of decisions. We have to be risk takers. I've taken risks in ministry many times and they failed. And then I've taken risks and nobody thought it would happen, and great things happen. So there's always risk and reward. And we do not live by bread alone, nor do we endure by vaccines alone. We have a spirit, a soul, a mind, a relational component to be considered. So I think as reasonable people, and by the way, I'll just say this, I have spoken with a physician. I've spoken with several people who worked in COVID units on this side of the border and on the other side of the border that have different opinions as to how this should be handled than those that are in official offices in the health departments of our region and province. So it's not true that all medical persons have a blanket sort of carte blanche, one size fits all approach to this. So we would of course, we understand that. We would consult people like that who do have expertise in that area. We would also obviously allow people who pastor churches like myself to speak into it, our elders, our other pastors, our staff members, and we would come up with a plan. We're already working on it, by the way, probably a hybrid model where most of our ministries would continue to be online and live. So there'd be small groups that meet online for people that aren't comfortable with meeting. There would be children's ministry online. There would be sermons and preaching online, but there would also be robust opportunities for people in reasonable numbers to come back in and start to associate and interact with one another. Really not that much different than the interaction we're doing in all of society, right? I mean, we're in grocery stores. I was in a Canadian Tire the other day. There's like 50 other people there, a bunch lined up outside, or whatever the numbers are. Don't quote me on that, not totally sure. We're going through drive-throughs at Tim Hortons and people are passing us stuff, and there's people lined up, reaching through the same window that we are. So I would just say we would balance the risk and reward. We'd be thoughtful and careful. No one would be stigmatized for not coming. But we would take the
I think
risk.
I think that's really key, Aaron, is you're allowing in your convictions that the church needs to be open, is you're asking the province essentially to, hey, let us self-govern our church as elders, and you're saying let your people self-govern themselves. So
Yeah, people do listen to leadership.
Right.
And some people listen very intently. You say jump, they jump. But most people aren't like that. Most people are going to weigh for themselves the pluses and minuses of their choice. I've had people say to me straight up, if you open the church next month, we're not coming for a while. I'm like, that's fine. It's no problem. And I've had other people say, if you'd opened the church a month ago, we'd have been there. So we do have in our church some different responses. You know what? I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine with that. Churches that signed the letter we sent to the government, great. Churches that didn't want to, fine, whatever. That's your choice. But right now, there's one size fits all, and the maximum allowable number right now in our churches is zero.
Right. So even as we would, like, there's people in our congregation who likely would be uncomfortable meeting in groups at this point. And fair enough, they have their own health concerns. There's health concerns in their families. They're assessing the risk and reward, the reward related to it, and they're saying at this point it's not worth it for us.
Right.
Fair enough. I would say there's a significant and vocal group within the church who think otherwise. Fair enough. I think one of the problems that we're seeing here is you're getting the highest power, the most centralized power to govern the smallest unit. And so the theological principle is a theological principle of subsidiarity, which means that it's the smallest unit that should be able to govern itself. And so I was reading this afternoon on the Spanish flu in Ontario, and one of the things that kind of struck me as I read about it is that it seemed to me the article that I read, now maybe someone knows more about this and they want to correct me, but it sort of seemed to me that every region in Ontario, as they were dealing with the Spanish flu, dealt with it differently. So Hamilton dealt with it differently, then Brantford dealt with it, then Windsor dealt with it. Brantford apparently was willfully and intentionally blind to it. This was right after the First World War, but then public health in Windsor compared anyone who would go out in public to the German enemy that they were fighting in the First World War. So Brantford thought, you're crazy for making an issue of it. People in Windsor thought, well, if you're not dealing with this and you're going to go out in public, you're spreading the disease and you're just as bad as our enemy combatants from Germany from the First World War. So what you found is the principle of subsidiarity. So right now you have the city of Toronto being governed the exact same way as the city of Timmins. Now, this is not right. And in the same sense that every family in our church has a different situation, has different circumstances, and every family in the church is going to be able to govern themselves through those. So we had our last Sunday service. A lot of churches has shut down. We decided not to, and we moved ahead with it. But we sent out a letter and we said, look, if you're of ill health, you are free to stay home. There's no pressure from anyone here for you to come out. And there were families that replied and said, we don't want to come out. And I respected that. I know what their situations were, and that should be just the same at this particular point. Now, you've mentioned, Aaron, that you've talked with a number of people in health care, as have I. And is there any common denominators that you're seeing as you, like, one of the privileges that we have as pastors is something that we can't take for granted. And that's why I also think we have something to offer our governing authorities here, is we rub shoulders and we talk with a broad sweep of society. Okay, so we know people, and people from all levels of society trust us and tell us things. And so we have a bird's eye view, like a church the size of yours. I don't know how many you have. I think your church is a bit bigger than ours. We have about 650 people in our church, 650. And so, I mean, I know people from all walks of life, and I hear all kinds of different perspectives. And so would you say there's any common denominators as you're dealing with people who are on the front lines of this, Aaron?
Yeah, I would say now I'm speaking to people of faith. So
Mhm.
they would be people that would hold my worldview, which means they see the spiritual component to humanity. They don't just boil us down to the end result of evolutionary processes and therefore just fixate on our physicality. They have a proper biblical worldview, and so they are people of faith. They are people who deny fear, but rightly have concerns. Okay, we should have concerns. I think concerns is a stewardship word. If you're stewarded with something, you want to do it well. You're concerned. Fear is more of like I want to be God kind of a word. So these are people that have concern but not fear. The common denominator is their view, working on both sides of the border. Okay, so we're a border city. So this is people working in Windsor and people working in Detroit. They would say, in their viewpoint, that the medical establishments they work in are hyper conservative, like hyper conservative. So even if you're in a hospital where there are 0 COVID patients, and in one of our hospitals, there's never been any that were actually in intensive care, 0 the whole time. That there's still like a culture of hyper conservatism. Don't open up, don't move forward. Now, in many respects, like if you're a physician, I understand that. If I was the head physician of Windsor, the head physician of the world, I'd be super conservative too, because my expertise is in the area of keeping people alive. So every decision I make, every conversation with a staff member would all boil down to how do we keep people alive? And I would do everything within my power to keep people alive. But I could easily fall into a hyper conservatism where I could be so concerned with keeping people alive, but look around like actually no one's really dying anymore, but I'm still concerned well they might die. So let's just keep the rules in place. So I'm hearing that. I'm also hearing toe the party line. Okay. And you can't even name names because of that, but it's like a toe the party line. Now, this is what concerns me, back to some of James's comments about human freedoms. I'm not a conspiracy guy at all. Okay, there's a virus out there, it's killed people, there's no question about it. Okay, there's no question about it. But one of the concerns is if it becomes politicized, and I believe it has, where you have to toe a party line. You can't sort of put your hand up in the room and say, I'm a physician too, and I don't agree. Or I'm in management, or I'm an RN, or whatever you might be, and I don't agree. There's not room for that, right? And in crisis, just like in a military conflict, you probably shouldn't have that in the thick of things. But when things settle down and everyone's kind of standing around evaluating the battlefield and how they did, you want that kind of feedback. You want the guy 3 ranks down from the general saying, sir, if you don't mind, I don't think that was a great move for us to charge that line. You want that. You don't want everyone to say, hey, sit down, shut up. And the narrative is, we did it right. We're doing it right. Just listen to the top guy and the top guy only, because we're all into authority and submission. That's not wise. And so that would be kind of some of the key thoughts that I've heard. And again, they're anecdotal, they're not statistical, because the system doesn't allow for this kind of stuff to become statistical.
Right, and I'm glad you share that, because this is what I'm hearing too. I'm gonna throw some statistics up in just a moment here, which I have offhand, but I have anecdotal stuff too. So we wrote this letter 3 weeks ago, and we got some blowback, some real positive stuff, but we did get a bit of blowback. And one of the things that was said on our blog was, I'm not going to name who wrote it, but it's on there, and it says this person said she's on the frontline staff, dealing mostly with she is someone who has been working around the clock to deploy and allocate our limited pool of frontline workers through this pandemic. And then she said, people of all ages are dying horrible deaths by this virus. So she said this in criticism of our blog, our letter, so on, people of all ages. And there was a lot of hysteria in her comment, but I'm gonna I'm going to throw up some stats here that are fairly recent so we can have a look at them. And what I want to do is I want to compare these to previous pandemics, outbreaks, and then I'm going to take note of an interesting conversation I had today with the director of a long-term care facility. But here's some stats here, just if I can pull them up. So this is Canada-wide as of May the 13th, which would be yesterday. This is compiled by a professor at the University of Lethbridge, Dr. Reginald Bibby, and James, that's out in your neck of the woods out there in Alberta. So a good Alberta boy there. But we have here the number of people who have died in various age groups and the statistics involved. So if you look at the age, this is not all ages. First of all, we need to understand that 20 and under, the number 0 is there. Okay, Canada-wide as of yesterday, 20 through 39, 15 people have died. But even if you go up to the highest number, which is 80 plus, you still have a 250 in one out of 1 million, 250 people out of 1 million have died. Now, every death is tragic. Okay, so in analyzing statistics, we're not sitting back coldly saying, well, people have just died. That's not what we're doing here. We care about every single human life. But we want to analyze how much death and carnage is out there. And when you start to look at, somebody who is between the age of 0 and 60 years old, and how many people in a country, 38 million people have died, and you're talking about 161 people under the age of 60 in a country of 38 million. This is not the Black Plague. This is not the Spanish flu. Okay, this is not the cholera outbreak. This is, and by the way, in looking at this, I talked to a lady who runs a long-term care facility today, and she told me, this is what the media doesn't tell us. The media, if you turn on the media, it's another died, another died, another died, another sick, another sick. It's endless bad news. So I asked her, I said, so in 2019, how many of your residents died in your long-term care facility? She's one, okay? This is anecdotal, it's not across the board, but she's one. And she said they have 176 residents in their facility, and in 2019, 74 of those residents died in their facility. So that's more than a third, less than a half died in 1 year. She said that on average, those in long-term care live for 2 years. So this is, she's saying across the board, they live for 2 years. So they go into the facility, and on average, they pass away within 2 years. And that's because people that go into those facilities are typically elderly and sickly. Most people in those facilities die of respiratory illnesses, most of them. The overwhelming majority die of a respiratory illness, typically pneumonia. And she says that 70% of the COVID deaths have occurred in the long-term care facilities. And this was interesting. This shocked me. I didn't heard this in the media. 50% of long-term care facility residents who have had COVID-19 have recovered. So 50% who have COVID-19 have recovered. And she was concerned, as I was talking to her, about all the media hype. Her comment about her particular facility, this isn't across the board because some have been hit harder, but her comment was the frontline staff there are dealing mostly with the uncertainty, heightened fear, and the unknown more than working tirelessly and running off their feet. That was her facility. That's her particular facility. Now, again, that's not all of them. That was her. But my point is the anxiety in that facility is greater than the threat of the disease. She says that in a long-term care facility in Ontario, for there to be declared an outbreak, there has to have one staff or one resident to have COVID-19 for that to be called an outbreak. And there's 626 licensed long-term care homes in Ontario. 180 of them have had a COVID positive outbreak, which means they've had one or more staff or residents have an outbreak. So that's 180 homes have had one or more test positive for COVID out of 626 licensed homes. So that's what she shared with me. And then you look at the numbers that we have on the screen here, and I think, okay, I did a little bit of research. In 165 AD, there was an epidemic in Rome that lasted 15 years, and it killed 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire, including the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it was likely a smallpox outbreak. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, spoke of caravans of carts and wagons hauling dead bodies from the cities. Okay, that's bad. In 250 AD, there was an outbreak in Rome whereby at its height, 5,000 people were dropping dead a day in Rome. In Europe, during the plagues, the Black Death, 30 to 60% of the population would die if it hit a city. And the Spanish flu in Canada, so we look at the numbers here. The Spanish flu is the one that we keep talking about because it's a reference point for us when there was somewhat of a lockdown. There were 8 million people alive in Canada at that particular point in time, and 50,000 of them died of the Spanish flu, and the majority of them were between the ages of 20 and 40. So that means with the Spanish flu, there were 6,300 approximately deaths per million, most of them in their 20s and 40s, whereby we're dealing with presently 140 deaths per million, and 97% of them are above the age of 60 at present. So there's some anecdotal things, and then there's some actual facts and figures compared to some historical analysis. Now, let me look at one more picture here. This kind of breaks it down a little differently for us. And where is it? There it is. This is of May the 8th. So that's just under a week ago. We have a population of 38 million. And this is prepared by the same professor at the University of Lethbridge. And if you looked at the bottom right, you're looking at what the computer models were. Now, when the computer models first came out, I was critical of them, and I said, look, there's no such thing as an inerrant computer model because there's too many variables, and providence directs things, and I'm not fatalistic enough to think that you can compute future events to a T. And then I spoke with an epidemiologist who I asked him what he thought about the computer models, and he said garbage in, garbage out. That's what he told me. And he said that his colleagues laugh about him because they get thrown up to the media, and the media just runs with them. But anyway, that's what he said. I'm like any field, there's going to be different opinions right across the board. You talk to 5 different pastors, they're going to have different opinions on Revelation 20, right? But all as I'm trying to say is that this is not, when you deal with experts, there's not one voice, but we're only hearing one voice. And if you look at the bottom right corner, you see Public Health Services using modeling data released April 9th suggested deaths could range from 22,000 in coming months, with poor containment resulting in deaths of 350,000. Well, presently, we're looking at about 4,500 deaths. So that's the reality of the numbers. We're not belittling the fact that people have died. I need to emphasize that, because you do this kind of thing and people say, they think you're belittling it. I'm not. It's concerning, okay? We know people who've been sick in the church with this. There's people in the church who have served in various group homes that have gotten sick and have suffered because of this. I've prayed with them. My wife's delivered them soup and whatnot. So we care about people and we want to love people. We do. But I'm just trying to, all we hear is one message from the media being pounded against us. And the media, if anything, has proven themselves unreliable over the years on a number of fronts. And if it bleeds, it leads. And so another death of coronavirus, well, that leads. But let's get back, and you can see my face for better or for worse. I've been told I have a face for radio. So anyway, there you go. But I want to move on to this, and Any thoughts on that, Aaron, what I've just mentioned there? Did you want to share anything? I'm sure you've had people in your church that have been sick with this, and you've had people on the front lines, I know.
Well, actually, to date, I don't personally know anybody that has had the virus. It's hard to say how many people associate with our church because not everybody's here every week. But the week before all this came down, we had 850 people that Sunday. And I was talking to some 3 or 4 of the staff today. I said, does anybody here know anybody with the virus? None of us, the 3 or 4 of us that were in that conversation didn't. So I can't really speak to that. I can just say, I've been around for 47 years. Over half of my life, I've lived in Windsor, Essex County. There are people here that have died from it. Personally, I just don't know anybody. So I'm sure there's many people that are listening in on this that know 1, 2, 3, 4, know a friend of a friend. I do know, and this is disturbing. You're always a little bit concerned about just sharing second or third party information, but I have heard from multiple people. So when I say multiple, I want to be careful. I would say probably 5-ish in Canada, and even a friend of mine in Romania that I was talking to, same thing. Just today, I was talking to a fella, and he said, my friend's mother died. And when her daughter looked at the death certificate, it said COVID-19 is the cause of death. And the daughter said, my mom didn't die of COVID-19. And that remained on the death certificate. Now, I'm just hearing this, but I haven't just heard it from one person, and I haven't heard it from Looney Tunes, and I haven't heard it from people that I've only known for 3.5 minutes. I've heard it from people that I trust. And there does seem to be, and I don't understand the reason for this. Maybe one of the people listening can offer some input on this, even in the Q&A. But for some reason, it's like someone put it this way, and it sounds kind of humorous. I want to be kind of obviously careful, but they said to me, one of the things that's been good about the coronavirus is nobody is dying of anything else all of a sudden. Like we're just not hearing. When was the last time you heard someone die? No one's died of cancer in the last 2 months that I know of. I haven't heard of any heart attacks. I haven't heard of any diabetes. Well, these things, I think, what's the number? Is it 800 people die per day in Canada? Something like that? 700s or 800 and change die every single day in Canada, just like in 2019. It was something like that with the statistics. You can check it out. Nobody's talking about those deaths at all. I don't remember the last time I heard about a car accident or someone that dropped dead of cancer or diabetes. I'm not hearing any of that. But it's still happening, right? And it's happening every day. Every day people are going into eternity. And it's almost like, we're all concerned about people dying. Well, why are we not talking about people that are dying of anything else? It's just all we're thinking about is people that are dying of one thing. And again, as pastors, we all have learned that you can be as clear and articulate as possible and people still take you the wrong way. Okay, and that kind of disturbs me. So I'm going to say once again what Pastor Jacob has said twice. There's not a man on this call who knows the Lord Jesus Christ as his Savior that would belittle or dismiss the fact that people have died from COVID-19 in our country. So if you're listening, I want to stress that we love God and we love people. And I would be very burdened if someone in my church died of the virus, but to date, no one has.
I would think we'd be having, and thank you, Aaron, for stressing that. And I'll stress the same again, just by emphatically saying amen to what you just said. I would think, Aaron, you and I would be having a very different conversation if the morgues were full and we were watching our neighbors being pulled out of their houses in body bags. But that's not happening. Nobody's having that experience.
Yeah, the part of the conversation that I would still be having is, what is the greatest expression of love for your fellow man? To be able to give up your life for them.
Mhm.
And one of the things that burdens me in all of this is that the Church of Jesus Christ, okay, not the school guidance counselor, not your friend you went to grade school with, the Church of Jesus Christ, ministers of the gospel, and that's not just like ministers of the gospel with a capital M and a capital G, like myself. Ministers of the gospel, the people of God, are not allowed to be with people when they are dying, because we might be infected.
Let me just share something for you.
This
And
is a shame. So I would be arguing for that, even if people were dropping dead, dropping dead all around me. The people of God, ministers of the gospel, should be with the dying in their hour of need, regardless of the consequences to oneself.
Amen. And Christians are to be given to hospitality, and Jesus told us to be with the lonely. I knew a guy. Listened to a guy talk this week. He's not a Christian. He got this better than Christians. He said his neighbor's 80 years old, and his neighbor invited him over the other day for a beer. And he says, "Well, I'm a young man. Do you really want me to go over there and have a beer with you? I mean, I could have this virus." And the 80-year-old guy says, "Look, I've been in my house for 9 weeks. I need some company. I'd rather die of coronavirus than be lonely for this much longer. So please come over and have a beer with me." And so the guy went over and had a beer with him. Okay? This wasn't a Christian man. But yet he understood the need for human interaction, and that showing hospitality and being with, actually physically being present with lonely people is a good thing to do. It is a good thing to do. Now, if the guy next door had said, "Stay away from me, I don't want to get the coronavirus from you," obviously, right? But the guy's begging him, "Come, please." And so I heard of another story of a long-term care facility in the area where the seniors are locked up in their rooms, and they're in quarantine. I don't know what happened there, and they weren't allowed out of their rooms. So the food's brought to the room. They eat the food, and a bunch of the seniors got together and had a mutiny and said, "We're meeting together. We're meeting together in the public area because we must have human contact, and this is natural." And which is bringing me to another point that I think is a legal issue that I just want to bring up and ask James what his thoughts on. Every sacred line in this crisis has been crossed. Private property has been trampled on. Private businesses and enterprise has been destroyed for a lot of families that have invested time, money. They've risked their lives or risked their finances to go into businesses. It's been trampled on. The church has been officially shut down, which is sacred. Okay, we're not allowed to take the ordinances together, baptize our own. Weddings had to be canceled or scaled back. The only line that has not been crossed, to my knowledge, in this country, James, is the state, the magistrate, has not walked into people's homes and forced them into quarantine. But this may seem like a shock to people, but I am absolutely convinced that the Antichrist could show up with computer projections and convince the public to hand over their wives and children and have them locked up in concentration camps to prevent the spread of virus if they put enough hype and spin behind it at this particular point in time. And people would hysterically demand it out of the love of neighbor. That's the only line, to my knowledge. There's probably a few nuances in there, and I'm not always the best at nuance unless people push me on it and ask me about it. But that's the last line, to my knowledge, that has not been crossed. And what do you do if the state shows up and says, "Hey, hand over your wife and your kids. We're going to put them in a cell for 3 weeks because we don't want this contagion to spread. We'll make sure they have food and oxygen, and we might even give them a bath every now and then." But so I don't know, James, do you have any thoughts on that? Am I being extreme here, or?
No, you're not. My understanding is that there's now either an order or legislation in Newfoundland that would allow a very similar scenario to what you were talking about, where there's no warrant required and no oversight from the judge, but the authorities can walk in to your house and perform a number of things, test people, whatever. I don't know if those powers have been, I don't know if those powers have been acted upon. I do know that there's talk of, and this is probably where you're most likely to see this. There has been talk of when and if there's a COVID-19 vaccination available, of not just demanding that people get it, and if they don't, withhold benefits or withhold access to services, but to actually forcibly vaccinate people, to come in and take your children, take them to the facility, vaccinate them, and bring them back. And certainly there's some in the Christian community that do not vaccinate and will not, and it's a matter of both health and their belief system for why they don't, and it's very serious to them. And this is a legitimate concern that many of them have, and that would not be something that would surprise me. I would hope that wouldn't happen, but if it did, I would not be surprised. That is consistent with other stuff that I've seen, and I'll give you an example in the transgender context, which was a big issue prior to this. There was legislation in Ontario that would provide the state to be able to come in and take a child from a parent if the authorities somehow find out that child was desirous of and trying to be a different gender, and if the parent was not affirming it, the state would have grounds to come in and take the child. And I haven't yet heard of any cases like that happening in Ontario, but certainly there's the legislation there that could permit that. Yes, I would agree that that's one of the last lines that hasn't yet been crossed, but we are on that line. And maybe it has been crossed already. I don't know. I mean, I've certainly heard cases of police enforcing quarantine through fines and turning people back to their houses, in BC and elsewhere. So, but coming in and taking, I haven't heard of it yet. I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't think we're that far away. And if we see a COVID-19 vaccination in Canada, that possibility is very real. And I think we need to start talking about that now, because I think that's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's a relevant issue for people of faith too.
Thank you, James. There's no government that has a right to stick things into our body if there is an enforced vaccine. And I appreciate you bringing that up, and it's been a concern of mine too. I want to move on. This is heavy stuff that we're talking about, and I am a Christian man. We're Christian men here. All of us are. We have faith in God. We know that God is using these things for His purposes. First sermon I preached after the lockdown, I talked about God is literally shaking the earth right now to bring forth His kingdom. So somehow He's working in the darkness, and we have great faith in Him. There is a big problem with this whole. Aaron's talked about it, the lack of balance. The only thing we're doing is consulting physicians. King Asa made that bad decision. King Asa had an ailment in his foot, and the Bible tells us he consulted the physicians, but he did not consult the Lord, and he received the judgment of God for that. One of the things about consulting the Lord is that when you consult the Lord, biblical wisdom is all-encompassing. It encompasses everything. And Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. I was going to close with this quote, but I'm going to share it right now, and then I'm going to move on to a few other things, and then we're going to have questions in about 10 minutes. But Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, and Solomon was a wise king. What did Solomon do? Well, 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Haman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. Now, how do we know he was wise? He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. So he was a poet. He was an artist. He wrote pithy little sayings and proverbs, and he spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He also spoke of beasts and birds and reptiles and fish. And so why was Solomon so wise? Because he had an understanding of everything. And in listening even to the premier, it's always about the chief medical officer says, the chief medical officer says, and biblical wisdom would admonish any ruler to understand how fully orbed life is. Now, in speaking of biblical wisdom, there was a man around in the 1600s, and Aaron and I have talked about this. His name was Richard Baxter. He was a pastor in the 17th century, and he was a great pastor. I've read at least one of his books, and I found great encouragement in it. But he said something to the effect that's been quoted by a lot of pastors recently. He said, if the magistrate asks you to refrain from meeting because of a pestilence, you do not meet. On the other hand, if the magistrate tries to force you not to meet because of persecution of Christianity, you meet anyway. So Baxter's position was, if it's because of pestilence, we do not meet. If it's because of persecution, we do meet. Aaron, would you mind commenting on that and offer some of your thoughts? Because I know you've thought through it.
So there's actually multiple historical figures that we respect and appreciate, circa 1500s, 1600s, 1700s that have similar comments. I shared a similar statement from a Reformed German man who was also the city physician in Bremen, I think it was, in Germany back in the 1500s. Similar kinds of things. He was actually writing a manual for how do we respond if this kind of thing happens. So from a Christian perspective, okay, if it literally boils down to that, so the magistrate says, stop meeting or people will die, we stop meeting, okay? We grade, right? The Bible says don't forsake the gathering together of believers, but you can't minister to people that are dead. So you weigh the conflicting absolutes, and the right response would be not to meet. And so I don't feel bad at all about the fact that when this all came about, we chose not to meet. I mean, it was kind of a bummer, but I think it was the right thing to do because that's what we were being told. I think that was a good and healthy thing to do. But now that we've had several weeks moving into months now to think about it, what I would encourage people to think about is there actually such a thing as a morally neutral decision? Is there such a thing as a morally neutral decision? And one could argue yes, if it's a matter of, I'm hungry, should I throw some mashed potatoes on my plate or some squash? You could say that's a morally neutral decision. And then there's, and with decisions that are not morally neutral, there's obviously a scale we need to consider. So an example of a moral decision, it doesn't have great consequence, but there's some morality there, is, should I cut this guy off in the mall parking lot to get the parking space? Like, how's that going to affect relationship and whatnot? So you could commit, a morally questionable act, but it's not like it destroys the world. So it's on the scale of, moral potency, it's kind of on this end. Obviously, if you go murder someone, it's on the other end. You got to factor in that. What am I being asked to do? What are the implications of this for people's lives or health or whatnot? Then you have to consider the source. Is this person, so we know we live in a very secular country. There's people that are immoral, meaning they believe in morals, but they don't care. There's people that are amoral. They don't even believe in the existence of morality. There's people that are moral relativists, like in the time of the judges. I just do what's right in my own eyes. And then there's people that believe in absolute morality. And people that believe in absolute morality make decisions different than moral relativists, immoralists, amoralists. So when we are receiving information or input or direction from anybody, we have to kind of think about where does this person, or where does this system, or where does this body of individuals, where do they fall on this? Are they absolute moralists, or we have to think about that? And I'm not saying that if you were to ask me, do you think that the top governing officials that have made this decision are absolutely immoral people that are out to kill people and dupe the church? I would say no, I don't believe that. I think in their heart of hearts, as best as they can, in their fallen humanity, they're trying their best, and they've convinced themselves that they're doing their best. But we live in a spiritually charged world, And these kinds of decisions aren't morally neutral for some of the reasons I've stated earlier. So as we weigh these things out, we're not throwing Baxter under the bus. There's some wisdom there, but we also have to factor in what is the source, what's the worldview of the person communicating it. Is there an agenda, a human agenda? If we say no, well, is there a spiritual agenda? Could it be that someone has someone other than a human being whispering in their ears? So we know this as believers. The devil hates your guts. He hates your guts. He hates the church. He hates life itself. And he will, in lesser or greater ways, infiltrate and access systems of education, systems of government, systems of religion to try to work his, black magic, so to speak. So we have to have our antennas up. And it doesn't mean that I'm telling you how you should necessarily respond, but these are considerations for us to bear in mind when the magistrate does say, do this or do that. We're like, okay, we need to weigh these things out. What are the moral implications behind the decisions that are being made?
Well, thank you, Aaron, for helping us think through that. Like Richard Baxter he was living under a Christian monarch too at a time when they were experiencing Black Death, which could kill 30% of the population. And you're right, like there's no such thing as a morally neutral decision. So if Baxter's living under a Christian monarch, that Christian monarch's decisions are going to be influenced by Scripture, and that monarch's going to have a view of the sanctity of the church. Let
me make one comment just to illustrate this point, just to kind of remind everybody. We're talking about the coronavirus. We forgot what we were talking about a few months ago, right? So let's just remind our audience that if you think our medical system is morally neutral, okay, let's just remind everybody, we live in a culture that has no abortion laws. So we kill babies in the womb. Lots of conversation and openness to euthanasia, the death of the elderly. As James mentioned, no problem denying the biological reality of one's gender and switching it, contrary to the parents and contrary to someone potentially even entering into puberty. So let's not forget that our medical system has already been infected with the disease of sin. And that's not to mean that every decision that a physician makes is necessarily a sinful act. In fact, most of them probably aren't. And we're thankful for physicians. Many of us are here today because some physician helped us at some point in our lives. But let's just not have this notion that science and medicine is just morally neutral. And whatever they say is necessarily uninfected by such things as human nature or sin.
Yeah, as thankful as we are for our medical system, it needs to be acknowledged that just a few months ago, that some of the top doctors were attempting to coerce the other doctors that are below them into referring people for abortion and medically assisted suicide. And so I guess the question that I have as we deal with our top doctors, I don't know the answer to this. Maybe someone can help me with this, who is a doctor. Are the top doctors that are making these decisions? Are they the same ones that were tyrannizing doctors with consciences a few months ago? And I really don't know if that is them, but if it was, that already shows an attempt to control people in a way that is not right, and is very terrible. What's next, guys? So we've talked a lot about this. We've looked at the situation. We've looked at the legalities scripturally. Aaron, you're a pastor. I'm a pastor. Our church sent a letter 3 weeks ago. Aaron, you did a wonderful job. You got 300 churches to sign a letter, and that was sent Monday. James, what are our options? What are our options if this keeps going on? What do you think?
Well, I think your options are continuing to engage the democratic process, and I think that's a valid exercise. I think that's worth time and energy. I think it's possible that will produce fruit. But I think if you're serious about this, and if you're acting reasonably, at some point, if the democratic process doesn't produce much fruit or enough fruit or fruit fast enough, you need to move to the next legitimate step, which is the legal, engaging the legal process, right? And I would say there's two ways to do that. The first would be to, while still adhering to the law, challenge the law. And then this is common. This happens. This is a lot of what I do. It's a lot of what we do, the Justice Center. And that would mean that you would continue to follow whatever restrictions were in place, but you would file a court challenge, and you'd be the named people. Whoever was filing it would be the, whether it's individual Christians or churches or a group of churches or whatever, they'd be the named people on the document, and you would pick all the restrictions, all the orders that you feel infringe your rights, and you would apply to the court to say, hey, I need the court to rule on whether these are constitutional or not. And by that, what I mean is, are these justified violations of our rights or not? And then the other way, of course, is to say, okay, well, we think that these restrictions are unlawful, and we think they're an unacceptable violation of our rights, and it needs to stop. You haven't responded to the democratic process, so we're going to engage this process, right? That's sort of the converse way to engage the legal process, is, of course, assuming the government doesn't acquiesce, assuming they take enforcement action to enforce their orders or legislation against you. Well, then you'll still end up in court. You'll just end up on the other side, where the government is trying to enforce and you're defending yourself. But the arguments, of course, would be very similar. They'd say, well, you would say it's an unjustified violation of our rights. This is why we did this, and so what we did was actually lawful. I don't know. This is probably a point I should mention is you can break the law and do so in a lawful manner. Trouble is that you won't know that you did it in a lawful manner until the court said you did, right? So obviously there's a very serious risk there. But when you exercise your constitutional right, and the exercise of that right is actually against the law, well, then you could actually be lawfully disobeying a law, right? And we have cases like this too. Like, we have ticket cases, for example. I have a street preacher that gets ticketed occasionally because someone complains he's making too much noise, and so he gets a noise ticket, and so we have to defend it, right? And then, but a result of that could be that the judge throws out the ticket and says, even though you broke the law, you did so lawfully because you were in exercise of your constitutional rights, and that ticket, that enforcement of that law, was unlawful, right? So those to me are the three options, right? And I think all three of them are legitimate things to consider. They each come with their potential risks and benefits, of course, right?
Thank you, James. Very helpful. Aaron, where are you at as a pastor on this, as you're trying to shepherd your people? We want to worship the Lord, and there's a lot of people in both our churches that do. Where are you at?
I think our first step here, and we've been doing this for a month now, is to trying to educate our people, helping them to think through issues. We're not trying to create the Borg where everyone thinks necessarily alike, but we're trying to educate our people, help them to think through the issues. I've taught several classes now on the moral and theological implications surrounding these issues. Step two, as I process this with our eldership, has been to craft this letter, which originally was just going to come from us. And there was some godly wisdom in suggesting we should probably try to rally some other churches. I thought we might get, maybe 10 on a good day to sign the letter. Obviously sent it to Jacob and Joe Boot, and Joe had some helpful edits and kind of probably knocked it down from about a 2.5-page document to a 1.5-page document, which is probably good. By God's grace, I this afternoon, I think we had 338 churches that had signed the online version. We have received some, silliness too. We had a submission from the Church of Satan, and the church from, the Church of the Harvest Cult, and the Church of the COVIDiots, and people out there that are going to sign and respond because they despise us. That's to be expected. We're going to hope for the best, pray for the best. There might be an opportunity for me to be on a Zoom call with the Premier tomorrow at 3. Still waiting for some feedback on that. I'm not totally sure. I think there's some reasonable people out there. If we were just blown off, I think we would do what Moses did. He goes back to Pharaoh over and over and over again. Let my people go, let my people go. So we would probably do that. We would belabor that. And then the step after that would be probably to sort of amp up the whole idea of charter rights, right? And Charter, just to be very clear, people have talked about civil disobedience. I'm not prepared for that. There's many steps before that. You know, the step before that is the whole charter rights, pushing for your charter rights. Like instead of saying, oh, we're going to break the law, you would want to approach the authorities and say, actually, from our understanding, you're in violation of the law. And so you approach them as the innocent, not as the violator of the law. In a free and democratic society, as was mentioned earlier, and you know, I'm just thinking through this myself, and I'm thankful for James's input. We live in a system that actually invites that. Can I make a sidebar comment? A lot of pastors and people are out there saying, well, Romans 13, just got to submit, just got to submit, just got to submit. It's not unsubmissive to challenge in a governmental system like ours. It's two different things. It's not inappropriate. It's not disrespectful. You know, we have a party that's in power, and across the aisle we have the official. That's a pretty weighty word. Opposition. The structure of our government itself invites opposition. So you can be a Bible believing Christian that believes in Romans 13 and Titus chapter 3 and 1 Peter chapter 2, all of which essentially say the same thing. Submit to government, honor the government. You can be a Bible believing Christian that honors all three of those critical passages and at the same time oppose peacefully what the government is doing, and you're not violating any of those things. So we would just continue to push for that, and obviously we're you know, encouraging our people. We're actually holding a couple of, they're going to be announced shortly, some couple opportunities for prayer and fasting in our church as well.
Great, Aaron. I think you and I think a lot alike on that. It's, you know, you're patiently petitioning, and then eventually you get to the point where you say, hey, you know, this is actually what the law says. And, you know, because the law is above the government just as much as it's above us. And any attempt to challenge that, whether it's in the courts or otherwise, is at their invitation. And it's very important to remember that.
I mean, James can correct me on this if I'm inaccurate, but my understanding is that the government is not the state, because governments change. You know, people are voted in, they're voted out. Now, the government obviously represents the state, but the state is the territory, it's the dominion of, it's the Constitution, it's the charter, that kind of thing. And again, James can correct me if I'm, you know, sound like a total rookie in this. But one could potentially be defending the state by disagreeing with the government, as I understand it. And if the state is in fact part of the charter rights, and the charter rights, of course, are based in, you know, moral and natural law, that would be my mindset. Would that be an accurate approach to that, James? Because this would be helpful for me to hear.
The way I would say is that the Constitution is separate from the state. It might be part of our shared identity or our shared culture or our shared heritage as a people, as a nation, but I would say it's separate from the state. And actually, it's because the whole idea is to stand as a guard, right, against the state, between the state and the people, right? So, like lawyers, for example, often call the charter a shield, right? It's the people's shield against the state. That's what it is. So I wouldn't say it's part of the state. I would say it's part of our, more in a broader, deeper sense, part of our nation, but not part of the state. I think your point about government not necessarily being equivalent with the state, I think it's a good point, because there's the state and all the apparatuses of it. You know, we have a huge administrative state in Canada, right? The state is huge in Canada. It's bloated, I would say, far beyond what it ever should have been, which is part of the problem, right? Because government is able to use the state and all the power it has to impose whatever it wants, and that probably shouldn't actually even be there, right? Yeah, I think it's good to remember that you know, Ford and his cabinet are the government, they're not necessarily equivalent with the state. I think that's fair to keep in mind, and that there's a lot of independent state actors that are just trying to do what's best here and there. But that goes back to Jacob's point. If you had less centralized control, I mean, always more centralized control is more bad for people. Always, history bears that out. The less centralized control and the more local control, even if it's government control, would be good. right? And that's a whole theory behind when we have MPs and why they come from certain ridings, right? And we don't have a proportionate system where we just 38% means this many MPs. No, it's this MP from this area, because that's supposed to be local government, right? It's supposed to resemble that. So that's what I would say to that.
I'm just looking through the questions here, and I'm thinking a lot of them have already been answered. Some of them were sent earlier on. There's one here. It's more of a pastoral question. I can reach out to the individual later. Here's one that I'll ask you, James, and then I'm going to close, okay? But I think this one was not answered. Maybe, I don't know whether you want to answer it or not in too much detail, but thanks for the information tonight, says Ryan. You've outlined the current actions of the government and your response as church leadership. As individuals, oh no, that's not what I'm looking for. Here it is. How can we get more in-depth insight into the things that are happening? James mentions he has a sense of urgency that most people don't seem to have, possibly because of his position, the things he has seen. Where can we get more of that perspective? So I guess the question is, James, you're raising the flag and you're saying civil liberties are a very urgent matter. I think Christians need to be up on this. Where can people get more information on this?
Well, certainly the Justice Center website, and I know that's a tall order. I mean, you're not going to become very familiar with things in one night. It would have to be, an endeavor to start reading some of these things, maybe a couple hours a week, and maybe after a course of a few months, then most of what I would know, anybody else could know just by going through. Almost every court document we have, it's on our website. It's there. All the affidavits where people talk about what's happened to them. All the factums where we argue the legal briefs, where we argue the facts, where we apply the law. It's all there. And even if you don't want to go to that level, you can just read all through all of our news releases, through all of our descriptions of our cases, just you get a feel for what's going on. So that's probably the first place. I guess I'll give you an example of this. There's a young man in my office. I like him a lot, and he has been a great benefit to me. He comes from the other side of society for me. I'm a bit of an egghead. There's a lot of things about pop culture that completely go over my head. He helps me with that. He came into our office, and he thought I was some doomsday, over the top, just thought the end of the world all the time. And after a few months of working in our office, he's in his 20s, he's a believer. And after being at our office for a few months, he just, he looked at me and thought, man, I get it. You're not just some kook who thinks the whole world is ending. Like the stuff we see here, like this is real. Like I had no idea, and he was like, it was big for him to come from this. He just kind of lived this regular life, right? He did come in to listen to mainstream media and Canada's great. And he works at us for a few months. Oh my goodness, like people don't realize what the mess we're in, right? My friends, they don't get it. They think I'm crazy now. Right? You have to unplug from the regular stuff and start plugging in to the other stuff, right? You think for yourself, right? And read for yourself, right? And I'm telling you, that stuff's out there, right? Our website's chock full. If you want to see what the state of freedom in this country, go read our website, right? It's the stuff with the Canada Summer Jobs and some of the church case, street preacher cases we have. You'll see the religious persecution, you'll see the death of free speech, you'll see it, right? But I understand most people would rather just enjoy watching Netflix, and even Christians. I don't know, probably not Netflix, bad stuff, but they'd rather just Pureflix maybe. They'd rather just chill, right? I get it, it's heavy. I'm a probably a different kind of person. I like the fight, I like the heaviness, I live in it every day. It doesn't really bother me. And my friend who I'm talking about in their office, he's the officer, right? He wants to go home and watch Pureflix, but he knows better now. And I would just, in life, there needs to be some light things, but if you avoid all the hard, heavy things, man, you're gonna end up being in ignorance, and you're gonna regret it. I get a lot of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They come to me, when I speak or just as clients. They say, "How did this happen? How did we get here? Like, how did I miss all this?" And I say, well, because you didn't look for yourself. You didn't dig for yourself. You You didn't learn. People have no idea how judges are appointed in this country. It's a big problem. As Christians, I think we ought to know that, right? But people don't. People in their 60s, 70s, they don't. And they come to me and they thought, nobody's ever told me this. So I know that I implore you to read. I implore you to read. I think as Christians, we have an obligation to know what's going on.
I appreciate you, James. I appreciate your heart, and some encouragement here. We have there's a great story in the Bible. We all know it. And just as, the Roman Empire, it was once somewhat of a democracy. It was governed by the Senate. And what happened is the society grew more and more corrupt. The emperors used these war measures, acts type things to appoint dictators for seasons. And Julius Caesar never let go of the dictatorship. Cincinnaticus was an honorable dictator because there was a war. He rose to power. He fought the war as a dictator. When the war was over, he resigned to the country, and he returned the powers back to the Senate. But as time went on and the society grew more degenerate, the Caesars themselves became more power hungry to the point where you get to Julius Caesar, and the dictatorship never ended. And the War Measures Acts or emergency acts, they were never done away with until there was a little baby born in a barn. And that little baby saw to it that his disciples took down the Roman Empire through their prayers and through the preaching of the gospel and Christian civilization. And all the freedom that entails came to be. And there may be a group of people out there praying and singing in a barn tonight. And those prayers and those hymns are powerful and glorious in the sight of God. In Numbers 13, Moses sent out 12 spies into the promised land. And most of them came back and whipped the people up into a panic. But Joshua and Caleb saw the fruit of the land, and they had faith in God. And they weren't afraid of the tyrants in the promised land. They saw the fruit. We need not fear disease. We need not fear an overbearing magistrate. We fear the Lord, and we know and we taste and we see that he is good. And that's why we want to worship him. That's why we want to gather to worship him as a church, because the fellowship of God's people, the singing of his praise and the partaking of the ordinances, and it's sweet to our lips and it is good for our souls. And so we pray that that day will come. Eventually the joy, and this is how I want to close. And I want to thank you, James, for being with us from Calgary, your busy man, and Pastor Aaron from Windsor. And this is how I'll close the night and we'll sign off. Eventually, I really do believe that the joy of Christian worship will trump the fear of the magistrate's quarantine. And we'll get there, and the church will be worshiping again. And the Lord will give us wisdom each step of this journey. And this is something that none of us would ever thought of. A few months back, and we were ready for some other battles, but we weren't ready to be dealing with this. And this is where we are. And the Lord has appointed us for such a time as this. And I trust that by his wisdom we'll move forward. So thank you, brothers, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I think this is going to be recorded and it'll be on YouTube a little later. And folks who weren't able to watch this can watch it then. But God bless you all. And may the Lord Jesus Christ have mercy on us. May he go before us, and may he grant us all wisdom.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Good night.